90% of serotonin is made in the gut. The problem is it can't actually travel into the brain because it can't cross the blood-brain barrier. Serotonin is quite a large, chunky molecule, and it can't fit through your blood-brain barrier to be used as a feel-good, kind of happy mode. What does happen is that your microbes effectively help your brain to access the building blocks of serotonin. So there's an amino acid called tryptophan, which is found in plenty of protein-rich foods like eggs, chicken and meat. And what the microbes do is that they help your brain to get the tryptophan to then make serotonin on site. And then you can make that happy serotonin right there.
So, Dr. Emily Leeming, it is an absolute joy to have you here today. I've been looking forward to this interview ever since I had the honour of reading your book, Genius Gut. It's just an absolutely brilliant book. So firstly, a warm welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's lovely to have you here. I think let's start just so the listeners can kind of get to know you, because you've been working in the science of the microbiome for quite some time and really involved in the research area. Do you want to just give us a little bit about your background, first of all?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm a research fellow at King's College London, where I research the microbiome, but also nutrition, because that's really my proper background is as a registered dietitian. But I can't not also share that the fact that my first job and my first career was as a chef. So I was a private chef for 5 years on super yachts, and that for me really shaped a lot of my perspective around food, but also making sure that it's practical and delicious at the same time.
Awesome. That must have been a fun few years.
It definitely was. You got to cook, travel. I mean, I really can't complain. Best way to spend your 20s, I think.
An experiment with some really different foods, I can imagine, as you were traveling.
Absolutely. You got to kind of land at different spots, go to local markets and just cook up an absolute storm for people who were any range of just having normal, everyday, wanting everyday food to, being celiac, to having like special dietary requirements. So you've just got to be like right in the trenches of understanding how people eat and what they want to eat.
And then you were involved in the research in the company that is now, was then and is now, has got quite big, Zoe, which I think everyone listening, in fact, the UK and the US, because it's over there as well now, and the blue poo that comes through on the Zoe test and looks at gut transit time. I guess people listening to this who may or may not have done it will be wondering, what is the ideal time when we're looking at our gut? Because there seems to be such a range for people in terms of how much they go to the toilet. And I guess on one sort of side of the equations, we have people who are very rigorous about it, shall we say, and even use things like coffee enemas and things like that. And then on the other end, people can be a bit more relaxed and it's like, I'm not really sure, maybe I'll go once every few days. What's really optimal there?
So it's going as many as 3 times a day to 3 times a week to doing a poo in the bathroom. That is literally, if you can be within that range, whatever's normal for you is absolutely healthy. So that can look very different from one person to the next, right? We're within that range. But that's where we're at.
So actually, if someone hasn't been for a couple of days, that doesn't necessarily indicate a problem.
No, absolutely. I think the key thing here is that if your own bowel habits change, so if your normal changes, then that could be a sign that there's something going on. But if your normal has always been, not going to the bathroom as often as someone else, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a problem or that there's something going on.
And what prompted you to write the book?
I think it was just really wanting to show that the brain is not separate from the rest of the body. I think we talk about kind of mental health and physical health as 2 separate things, whereas they're very much connected. Your gut and your brain are constantly talking to each other. And what you eat can affect your mind and your brain function and your mood. And really understanding that there's so much more to it than just nutrients and your gut, so much more to your gut than just being a digestive system.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. Just like how much we're hearing about it in the last few years, I think. And we'll come on to talk about female hormones as part of that as well. So the microbiome is really what we're kind of here to talk about, and the link with the brain. Can you sort of sum up what is the microbiome and what's it doing? Because we're hearing so much about it, right? And how it's implicated even in the way we control our blood glucose now, in conditions like PCOS. What is our lovely microbiome, or not so lovely if we're not looking after it, doing?
So the microbiome really means like all the microbes that we're kind of covered in. So we're covered in microbes inside and out. But normally when we talk about the microbiome, we're referring to the gut microbiome. So the microbiome is effectively a collection of bacteria, viruses, yeasts, and archaea. And there's about 100 trillion of them in our gut microbiome. And we've got as many of them as we have stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So we're absolutely inundated with microbes. And I think we've got to think about it in the perspective that microbes were here before us. We have co-evolved microbes. They've never been a part in our lives, in our whole kind of evolution trajectory where we haven't had microbes involved. And we're actually as microbial as we are human. So if aliens were to come down from space and kind of classify us as a breed, they'd probably classify us as a hybrid because we have as many microbial cells. We're half microbial and we're half human cells.
It's really, really interesting. And so what would you say are the key ways that we can really look after our microbiome? And then we can touch on some of the things that are big sort of no-nos.
So there's many different influences on our gut microbiome, but the main contributing factor, one of the biggest contributing factor, is what we eat. Because your gut microbiome lives in your lower intestine, and most of the food you eat is absorbed in your small intestine, but the food that makes its way through to your lower large intestine is fibre. And fibre is the roughage from plant foods like beans, legumes, whole grains, and nuts and seeds. And what your gut bacteria do is they feed on this fibre, and there are also some other components that they enjoy to eat as well. And they produce these special molecules called short-chain fatty acids, and also plenty of other metabolites too. And it's really about helping them to produce these molecules and these metabolites that is what is important for our health. So it's not necessarily who your gut bacteria are, but what they do, because it's these metabolites that then can travel across your body, talking to your brain. They can also influence your heart, your liver, your lungs, so many different other parts of your body. So it's about feeding the quality of food that you're feeding your gut bacteria to help them produce these metabolites that are able to have such an effect for our health.
And what are the kind of things that the short chain fatty acids are doing in the body?
So in terms of the gut-brain connection, there's like two main things that they're doing. So they're very much acting as kind of battery chargers for the cells lining your gut. So this lining of your gut is really important to make sure that it stays strong, because it's going to stop things getting through into your body that shouldn't be there, but also letting nutrients pass through. These short-chain fatty acids also travel to your brain, and they help with your blood-brain barrier lining. This, again, acts like a protective barrier. It effectively acts like a fortress, preventing toxins from getting into your brain, but also helping the smaller molecules that are healthy getting to your brain, like nutrients that your brain needs. So your short-chain fatty acids are playing a vital role in making sure that your blood-brain barrier is staying healthy.
Super interesting, right? And protecting us, as you say, from toxins and things like that. And you and I were just talking offline about things that we're not quite sure of the ramifications of yet, but don't look great, like microplastics and things like that.
Yeah.
What would be, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, with short-chain fatty acids as well, we do see that there's lower levels in some disease states in terms of the brain, but also conditions like depression. And also we've seen in mice models of stress and Alzheimer's to have low levels of short-chain fatty acids.
Yeah, and it's interesting, actually. I want to come on to that because I know you cover stress in the book. What are the types of foods that we would eat then to encourage the production of these short-chain fatty acids?
So we talk about fibre as a whole, but really we're referring to kind of prebiotic fibre, which is prebiotics are effectively a substance that can feed your good gut bacteria to kind of produce a health effect. And these specific fibres tend to be found in foods like onions, garlic, leeks and asparagus, and also chicory root and other vegetables. What we also need to think about when we talk about prebiotics, it's not just about fibres, it's also another group called polyphenols. Now, these are a group of antioxidants that effectively give fruits and vegetables their colour. So this is why we talk about, the age-old advice to kind of eat the rainbow. Actually, a lot of this is because of the polyphenols, because the polyphenols will be different in a red tomato versus a purple aubergine. And so eating lots of variety of these different polyphenols, there's about 8,000 polyphenols available, are going to feed those different gut bacteria the foods that they need for them to produce all those different metabolites for our health as well.
Interesting. And I guess something that I think many people worry about, and this can cause concern, especially as it can get quite expensive, is the use of pesticides and things like that. And I know that on social media, we can hear quite extreme views, right, of like, never eat a blueberry that isn't organic, it's really bad for your brain and things like this. I've always sort of advocated that you need to eat the best quality you can, but that these foods are so nutritious for us that it wouldn't be a reason to exclude them just because you can't find organic necessarily. I'm curious as to what your view is and from the research and things that you've seen.
Absolutely. So I think when we're talking about pesticides themselves, most of the research seems to be done on mice. What is quite difficult to extrapolate from these particular studies is that the dose given to mice isn't necessarily what you would have in a realistic amount for humans. So I think it's really hard to say, okay, but this was seen in mice, is that actually necessarily relevant to how much we might actually consume, which is probably far, far less as human beings than every day. The other thing was when we look actually at the kind of nutrients differences between organic and non-organic fruits and vegetables. So there are some nutrients that have been shown to be higher levels in organic foods, but actually we don't know whether that is actually a significant amount for our health. So yes, there might be some slight differences, but it's probably not actually enough to make any difference for us day to day in terms of our health. So I very much kind of advocate, very similar to you in this, that spend your money getting the best food that you can in a way that you're having as much variety as possible. And if you want to choose organic, then choose organic, but don't feel like you have to, because ultimately, as long as you're getting the fruit and veg in, that is the key important thing for your gut microbiome and for your health.
Thank you for clearing that up. And what about with things like, for example, the use of glyphosate and whether that might increase intestinal permeability, particularly in combination with gluten sensitivity? What are your thoughts around that?
I think maybe that's a question maybe we'll not, because I don't know too much about that, to be honest, that one.
In terms of that, okay. With neurotransmitters, this is an interesting area because you touched on this a moment ago, just talking about the link between the brain and the gut and also mental health issues. I know that we hear like banded around 90% of serotonin is made in the gut, and in the book you very helpfully distinguish how serotonin operates within the gut and how different that is within the brain, and the same with things like GABA and dopamine. This is very interesting for me, and I know that listeners can get the book to dive into a little bit more detail on this, but can you explain that, because I think it's very interesting around serotonin in particular.
So I think this phrase 90% of serotonin made in the gut just needs a little asterisk right next to it and the kind of a but sign, because it's true 90% of serotonin is made in the gut. The problem is that serotonin has many different uses in the body. It's not just our happy feel-good hormone. And the serotonin made in your gut is used by your gut to help with your digestion. It can't actually travel into the brain because it can't cross the blood-brain barrier. Serotonin is quite a large, chunky molecule, and it can't fit through your blood-brain barrier, which is effectively like a fortress with gates. And so it can't fit through the gates to get to your brain to be used as a feel-good, kind of happy mode. What does happen, so this is where kind of, we can say but, is that your microbes effectively help your brain to access the building blocks of serotonin. So there's an amino acid called tryptophan, which is found in plenty of protein-rich foods like eggs, chicken, and meat. And what the microbes do is that they help your brain to get the tryptophan to then make serotonin on site. And that's the serotonin that's used for your mood. And the tryptophan can get in because it's a lot smaller. So it's a little bit like having trying to, the ready-made serotonin is a little bit like a ready-made sofa that you're trying to shove through a door into your flat. Whereas the tryptophan is a little bit like, okay, you brought the kind of flat pack version of the sofa, and you're just taking the arm through one at a time to get into your flat, and then you can make that happy serotonin right there.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. And I read some research around the fact that if you combine protein-rich food with carbohydrates, then the carbohydrates can help to move that tryptophan across the blood-brain barrier and act almost like a taxi.
Yeah, so there's some research into that. I think we need a little bit more clarification from other research areas, because there is one researcher who has really dived into that. But I think they haven't necessarily seen that in other evidence, in other studies. So I think there's a lot more for us to understand and really appreciate about how this is happening, and understand a lot more about the mechanisms.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So if we're looking then, after what you were saying there around these sort of, just to clarify, right? So for people listening, is the serotonin that's made in the gut is used in the gut for like muscle contractions and digestion as you go into in the book. That doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. However, our gut microbes can help the building blocks like tryptophan to go across there so that the brain can manufacture its own. So when we then look at mental health conditions, are those more prevalent in people who are eating ultra processed foods, even if they're getting protein from, say, McDonald's or Burger King or something like this? What's kind of going on there, and is part of that maybe inflammation and other things that's causing that decline?
Yeah, so we know from kind of big population studies that if you have a poor quality diet, you're more likely to have a mental health disorder. So we've got a lot of kind of evidence around big population studies. In 2017, there was the first randomized control trial looking at using diet as a treatment strategy for depression. So what they did is that they had half a group of people on a Mediterranean dietary pattern. So that is a very gut-loving diet. It's rich in polyphenols, it's rich in fibre, there's lots of beans, legumes, whole grains, fatty fish, extra virgin olive oil. And then they had the other half on a kind of social support. So you were still having those kind of behavioural touch points to make sure that you understand that you're just looking at the diet for the other group as well. It's not because they're just interacting with someone, which we know has a mental health benefit. So both groups were still on antidepressants if they needed to be. Both groups were still doing regular therapy if they needed to be. But what they found in the diet group was that 30% of the people actually, after the end of the 3-month trial, had full remission of their depressive symptoms, showing that diet really can play a role for many people in their mental health. It can be another tool in the toolkit for looking after your mental well-being. And I think these studies talking about kind of depression can be really useful for many of us, because we all have mental health. And I think I was at a talk a few weeks ago where I was followed by the CEO of the Mental Health Foundation, and he brought up this really amazing stat. And he said that they basically did a survey of the UK population, and they asked them, who thought they had bad mental health and who thought they had good mental health, or kind of didn't think much of their mental health at all. And they found that only 13% of people said that they had good mental health. So I think that just shows that even if you haven't got, depression or kind of clinical mental health disorder, we all have mental health, and it's all something that we should be looking at. And I think we really need to shift that 13% saying that we've got good mental health to a much bigger proportion of people.
Was that 13 or 30?
13.
13. So this is really consistent with some research that I've done, just people completing a quiz. And we've had over 25,000 people do that now. And what we found is that around 90% will say that they feel flat or lacking in motivation, which really correlates with that research. And I myself, I was very surprised that number, because even 25,000 is not a small number, right, to look at. So yeah, hopefully we can help people, and this book in particular will help people with mental health. What about when we look at things like dopamine? It's often dubbed the molecule of more. and the role that plays in terms of the gut, but also the brain, and looking at motivation, but also things like ADHD, for example. What can you share around that?
So dopamine is your kind of, I like it, let's do it again molecule, and it tends to get released, in anticipation of doing something that you enjoy. And then you're more likely to want to do it again. So you kind of get a whack when you're you're anticipating doing something, and then you can also get a release when you're actually doing it as well. So when we're eating something, that's what can help us feel this anticipation of something being pleasurable. And then we get that kind of follow up with it being pleasurable. We don't know that much about kind of ADHD and different kind of neurotypical conditions or disorders. I don't want to say conditions or disorders. Actually, maybe we just cut that. I don't know whether what kind of angle were you wanting to go there?
I was just curious on whether we could improve symptoms for people, things like ADHD with focus and concentration, and I guess less spontaneity maybe when it's not appropriate if they have a diet that improves this.
Yeah, I think we're okay to talk like this, right? Because you said you were going to edit stuff out.
Yeah, I'm noting down. Yeah.
Okay. I think because that's not really in the book about, I don't know, dopamine and ADHD. So
Okay.
I wouldn't feel.
So you mentioned ADHD when I was going back over it. That's fine. We can leave that. No problem at all.
Talk about the gut microbiome and ADHD and what we know with autism.
Okay, let's do that.
Yeah.
What about when we're looking at the microbiome and we look at conditions like ADHD and autism? I know that's been sort of talked about for a number of years, a little bit now, around how someone's microbiome might contribute to that. And there's growing research. Can you share anything more in relation to that?
Absolutely. So we know that there are differences in people's gut microbiome if you have autism or ADHD. What we don't know whether that necessarily means that there's a contributing factor from your gut microbiome, or whether actually it's just a symptom of something that's already happening. So for autism is probably, the best example for this, because we know that people who have autism tend to also be very picky eaters. So it's quite difficult for us to see whether these differences in gut microbiome in people with autism is from due to the fact that their diet is different and therefore that is changing the gut microbiome, or is it because the gut microbiome is different because of the autism, or causing some kind of contributing factor that is affecting autism. What we do know is that there's some kind of early research around probiotics, certain types of probiotics, helping to alleviate some symptoms of autism. So that's not to say that, we're kind of offering this as a kind of cure-all to anybody with kind of autistic traits. It's more to say that, okay, maybe it's another tool in the toolkit, that if you're having issues with sleeping, for example, that taking a certain probiotic might be able to help manage that specific symptom.
Interesting. And are there specific strains of probiotics in relation to autism that you found?
So a probiotic definitely needs to have, you need to be that specific strain. So the way I talk about it in the book is effectively making sure that you've got the postcode when you see a probiotic and you're picking it up from the shelf. And that is effectively at the end, it needs to be described all the way down to having numbers or letters at the end. And that is what it's called, its strain designation. Because it's quite similar to how, you might have, Briar Road, for example, in one city versus Briar Road in another city. You don't necessarily know which one it is unless you've got the postcode. So it's very much the same with our gut bacteria. And what we need to know is that it's got evidence of that strain in that particular issue that you're looking for help with. So there are certain strains that can help with a certain area, and there'll probably be very different strains that will help with something else, which is why taking a general probiotic isn't necessarily probably going to be helping that many people, particularly if you're having a varied and healthy diet.
Interesting. And yet so widely used. What about when we're looking at estrogen and the gut microbiome? You touch on this a little bit, and how estrogen can get recycled. This seems to be also a kind of very Goldilocks effect. That's in terms of what's needed, because if there's too much recycled, right, then perhaps people can suffer from things like estrogen dominance, especially if there's not enough progesterone. How can we be optimizing that process by sort of eating things that encourage that healthy microbiome?
So with estrogen and your gut microbiome, effectively when kind of estrogen is kind of got rid of in your body as waste, it goes into your gut, and your microbes can help to pull apart this estrogen. And almost like taking the parts from an old car, you can then recycle some of those parts back into the body to be used as estrogen again. So that's the relationship with the microbiome and estrogen. What we see with what's interesting is it seems that it depends on your gut microbiome, whether how kind of useful that is for you with or how useful your microbiome is in menopause, because there are certain foods that contain an estrogen like compound called phytoestrogens, so things like soy foods. And what your certain gut microbes can do is help to also break that down for that to be used back into your body as estrogen again. But what's interesting is that in certain population groups, they have higher amounts of these kind of estrogen kind of breaking down microbes. So, for example, in Japan, they, in certain studies, they've seen that they have about 50% of these types of microbes, whereas in the US, they see they have about half that. So it could be that there is some kind of relationship there with how much these soy foods that contain these phytoestrogens can, for example, help with menopause symptoms in later life. So in theory, could it be that in Japan we see that they have less menopause symptoms like hot flushes? Could that be one of the reasons why?
That actually they're more effectively able to use these phytoestrogens than perhaps we are. So then it wouldn't automatically follow that if we eat lots of phytoestrogens, we're going to achieve the same result.
I think with the research where we know it at the moment in terms of the menopause, with taking soy foods and phytoestrogens, is that it's very much on an individual basis, because we don't have a lot of research in this area yet in terms of what help with menopause symptoms. And the research we do know is a little bit fuzzy. We kind of see some benefits with some studies and some benefits and not with others. So could the microbiome be involved in this? Potentially. But again, when it comes down to practical advice, it's probably one of those things where try it, see if it works for you, and maybe you might get some benefit of it, but also be aware that it might also not cause you any benefit.
It might not. What about moving on to the effects of stress on the microbiome? I think that it's fair to say we've all had a significant amount of stress in the last few years, in the last 4 years in particular. What effect is that having on our microbiome?
Yeah, so this all really kind of began and this understanding about this relationship with stress and the microbiome from kind of mice models, where they looked at mice and they found that those that were highly stressed had a very different microbiome. So this was kind of early in this field of research, and it really kind of got the understanding of going in terms of the microbiome and looking at stress. What kind of we see later on is that being stressed does have this kind of detrimental impact on your gut bacteria. Effectively, when you're stressed, a little bit of stress is all right, right? A little bit of stress helps with your performance, helps you to kind of do well in exams or kind of do a great presentation at work. But then your body then is able to kind of come back to status quo and settle down, and there's absolutely no side effects from that. Same with your gut microbiome, it's able to handle that fine. What happens when you're chronically stressed and you have long-term stress is a little bit like being a train that's going around the train track really, really fast again and again and again. And what happens is that train track starts to get a little bit rockety, and the wheels start maybe coming off the train. And that can then cause problems for your immune system because it's not able to kind of calibrate what's happening. So this then has a knock-on downstream effect on your gut bacteria. Because effectively it's having to kind of handle having a kind of an inhospitable environment created. Your gut bacteria, though, aren't just kind of sitting there being kind of victims of what's happening. They also interact with your body and actually help you to manage stress. So if we go back to these mice models, what they were able to see is that the mice that didn't have a microbiome versus those who do, so they're able to breed mice in special germ-free facilities to look at them to see if they have no microbiome. They found that those mice had a heightened stress response to because they didn't the mice that didn't have a microbiome had a heightened stress response.
It's very interesting, because I remember going to an event in London. It must have been, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, with Tim Spector, where he talked about the experiment that he was originally going to do, I believe, on himself. And then actually, I think his son did the experiment where he ate McDonald's for a period. I can't remember how many weeks it was. And it was only McDonald's 3 times a day, I believe, if I'm recalling this correctly. And then a year later, his microbiome had still not fully recovered in terms of its diversity. Then it would suggest that, on what you're saying as well, that if you don't have a diverse microbiome, then you are going to be potentially less resilient to stress.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think if you don't have a diverse microbiome, you're also, it's not just being less resilient to stress, you're less resilient to pathogens coming in and kind of, causing problems. You're more likely to end up with kind of irritable bowel syndrome, for example, or kind of gut issues, because if you're going too far the other way, it's as if you're going, really to causing problems for your gut microbiome. But again, it can be very individual for what might end up taking you there.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because that was one of the key things that I took away from the book when I was reading it, is I think we often think, like in particular with stress, I just need to like really take care of my mental health and I need to have strategies to reduce stress. And we definitely don't jump to the conclusion that our microbes might be helping or hindering us in that respect.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with with chronic stress, it can be a little bit like kind of pulling an elastic with our gut microbiome. So our gut microbiome can help us to come back and repair after stress and be kind of back to normal. But actually, if we keep pulling that elastic then becomes a bit loose and it's not able to do that as much. And that's kind of what happens with our gut microbiome.
Interesting. So if we go through, I mean, there are periods, right, in everyone's life where they go through a longer period of stress. It could be financial, it could be the loss of a loved one, it could be, a relationship that's broken down. In that situation, in any of those sort of situations where there is long-term stress, would we expect to see the diversity of the microbiome change just because of that stress? Is that having an impact that way, even if that person, which I guess is less likely to be the case, right? Because in times of stress, we don't look after ourselves quite as well. But if someone was to eat well during that period in terms of that diversity, could the stress itself still be impacting the microbiome?
Absolutely. Yes. I think the thing is that we don't know how much stress and how long for. So in my studies, that it seemed to have a significant impact if they're chronically stressed for 2 weeks. But
Wow.
we don't know what that means for humans about how long that is. And I think it depends again on what your starting gut microbiome is, what the other picture of your health is going on, and so many different factors like how old you are, your genetics, how much exercise you do, if you live in an urban area or if you live in the countryside. All these factors we know influence your gut microbiome, although we know obviously diet is like a hugely important factor in this.
So our gut is actually talking to our brain, I think, is one of the things you say, via the vagus nerve.
Yeah, it's so directly through the vagus nerves. It's a little bit like picking up the telephone for the gut microbes, because your vagus nerve is physically connected between your gut and your brain. But there are other routes and pathways too. Your gut microbes can communicate through your immune system, probably maybe a little bit more like sending a letter in the post where it's getting changed hands a few times before it gets to its destination. It also communicates through hormones and through those metabolites as well.
Interesting. So possibly not your area, because you're focused very much on the brain and the gut, but it kind of like, I guess it brings a question in my mind then when we look at the vagus nerve and we look at the link between heart rate variability and that being a measure of how much adaptability we have, right, to stress, and how much capacity effectively we have. that in turn then may also be affected by our microbes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, this is a new fascinating area of research. So I think there's a lot of really exciting, interesting science that is coming out in recent years. But I think there's still so much. I think the next 5 years is going to show us even more about what we know about this relationship.
Yeah, very interesting. So another area that was quite interesting when I was scrolling through your Instagram feed, which everyone should definitely go check out, is just when you were talking about the link between ultra processed foods and the kind of damage that they may occur, or the adverse effects, if you like, and looking at ultra processed meat product or meat imitation products compared to bread, which you were sort of putting forward maybe because actually it contains more fiber, even though it may have other things like emulsifiers. That was interesting. Can you explain a bit more about that for the listeners?
Yeah, so I think ultra processed food and the research around it is still, although we're talking about it a lot, and every day, it's still an early field of research, and we've only really had one really rigorous randomized control trial looking at ultra processed foods, and we know that as a whole, these ultra processed foods are detrimental to health, and we're eating too many of them. 60% of the UK's diet are made from ultra processed foods. But what the researchers who kind of started and kickstarted this classification system, they didn't really think that it was going to be a tool for people to go and, to go to their supermarket and discover, what foods they should or shouldn't eat. It was going to be this kind of population, looking at population groups and doing research, as a whole rather than an individual. So there's a lot of confusion about what ultra processed foods are, necessarily unhealthy and which ones are healthy, because they're not all the same. So things like oat milk, are they really the same in terms of your health as, say, having kind of a kind of processed hot dog? I think we can be kind of quite clear that there's kind of quite strong differences there. So this was really interesting research where they broke down all the different categories of foods within ultra processed food groups, and they looked at the association with having more than one disease. And what they found actually was that there were two food groups which we can all well recognise as not being very great for our health if we're having them in large quantities, that were kind of associated with these having more than one disease. And these were having ultra processed meat and also sugar sweetened beverages, so things like fizzy drinks, for example. What was really interesting is they actually showed that some food groups were protective. So they were healthy and they were helping to prevent these linked to preventing these diseases. And this primarily was cereals and bread products. So ultra processed cereals, ultra processed breads. And what the researchers thought the reason this might be is because they contain fibre, and this fibre might be offering this protective effect. Because we know that most of us are not getting enough fibre. We're not getting enough fibre that we need, which is really important for our gut, really important for our gut microbiome.
Interesting. And how much fibre should we be getting? I've seen kind of varying amounts stipulated.
So we should be having at least 30 grams of fibre a day. Most of us in the UK are having about 60%, so we're only eating about 18 to 20 grams. Now, we think that's actually a really big nutrient deficit, that we're not meeting that 30 grams of fibre a day on a daily basis. So it's really, and I think, even just adding in an extra kind of 7 grams of fibre, so that's the equivalent of maybe half a can of beans, is associated with, 7 to 8% lower risk in heart disease, type 2 diabetes, stroke, so many different diseases that fibre is seen as being protective.
Interesting. And what about when we look at artificial sweeteners? It seems such a hotly debated area, with sort of extremities, I guess, on both sides of the equation here. Where do you come out in relation to artificial sweeteners?
I think it depends on the type, and it depends on the dose and how often you're having certain sweeteners. I think like ultra processed foods, everything's kind of been grouped into one. and then they've been given the same label. And I think that's really not the case at all. So, for example, saccharin and sucralose have been shown to have absolutely no effect on your gut microbiome. So, in terms comes to your gut bacteria, yes, there's still a lot that we don't know about it. A lot of the nutrient databases that we have in research, we just don't have that kind of ingredient level detail in terms of researching it. But there are groups that are looking into this intensively. The research that we do have when it comes to understanding about this a bit more tend to be, again, in these mice studies. And then it's again this problem of what is the dose? Is it realistic in terms of proportionally versus a small mouse to what a large human would have? And also, thinking about the rest of the diet is really important, because if you're just giving a mice, probably just some average kibble and some high dose of sweeteners, is that really the same as having plenty of fruits and vegetables and like the occasional can of Coke or something like that? So I think we've really got to think about it in the context of really actually what matters the most. It's probably getting enough fibre in, getting enough fruits and vegetables, all those really impactful things for our gut microbiome. Occasionally having some sweeteners or emulsifiers is unlikely to be doing anything detrimental. It's very much thinking about how much you're having, how often is it happening, and really thinking about what types might be the problem. And I think we'll know a bit more in the next 5 years on that too.
So saccharin and sucralose, currently there isn't research to show adverse effects to the microbiome?
No, non-humans.
Okay, interesting. Because some people have spoken about how sucralose may increase your the way you process blood glucose, for example. But it seems that there doesn't seem to be a clear consensus on that.
No, absolutely. I think this is why we're getting hints of things we need to explore more, and that the microbiome might be playing a role in this kind of difference. But I don't think it's enough yet to have kind of tangible advice without kind of causing a lot of drama over something that may actually not be that important.
Not be that important. Yeah. And it's also difficult, I guess, as well, where you were saying, like, is fiber the bigger indicator? Because it's very different, I suppose, someone who's having artificial sweetened beverages, right? And a lot of those sugar sweetened beverages have now been replaced with things like sucralose, and they're eating a predominantly ultra processed food diet, and they're not getting lots of fiber in comparison to somebody, say, for example, who is really into their fitness and maybe has a protein shake that has a bit of sucralose in it, but they're also chucking a whole load of berries and different things or greens in it. That's a very different setup, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where food seems so simple on the surface, but it's actually very complex. And this is why, our scientists will love researching it. I think when it comes to emulsifiers, there was a really interesting study that effectively modeled the impact of, they looked at 20 different emulsifiers in a fake human gut. And what they found was that there were two types of emulsifiers that particularly gave kind of an inflammatory effect and were seen to be detrimental for the gut microbiome. And this was polysorbate 80 and carboxy, I can never say it.
Oh, is it carboxymethylcellulose or something?
It trips me up every single time I say it.
It's because my son says it to me. Like, he was looking at the back of wraps and he was like, don't get this because it contains carboxy. And yeah.
Hopefully, in a month's time, I'll be better at saying it. I've been tripped up on about it like 10 times. So these two emulsifiers were seen to be kind of cause a significant problem for your gut bacteria. What will hopefully kind of help us feel a bit calmer about this is that actually there was a survey done of about 6,000 to 7,000 foods in the UK that contained emulsifiers. And they found that only 1.4 to 0.06% of foods contained these emulsifiers. So really, 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 really small minimal amounts of the foods that are available contain those two emulsifiers. And actually, the most common emulsifier, lecithin, wasn't found to be detrimental to the gut microbiome at all. So I think it's just thinking about these in terms of, again, who are these? Like, what is the emulsifier that we're thinking about? What is the frequency and the dose? and really thinking about the big picture. Of course, if we're having lots of emulsifiers, that has been shown to be a problem. So in a study of about 500 people, they showed that if you had a high intake of emulsifiers, they were more likely to have more inflammation.
Interesting. I mean, what I'm really taking away from this and what I took away from the book is really, if we want to look after our microbiome and our brain health, is we need to focus on this fiber and diversity and all these beautiful polyphenols and color-rich fruits and vegetables to support ourselves and look after our sleep and our stress.
Absolutely. And getting it to, get plenty of oily fish in as well.
And oily fish as well. Okay. Interestingly, that's also supportive, is it, of the gut microbiome?
Yeah, so we talk about omega-3s predominantly around the brain because they're really important for the brain cell membrane. And in the UK, we have some of the lowest blood levels of omega-3, which is really, really bad problem for our brain. But also omega-3s are also prebiotic-like effect for our gut bacteria. Our gut bacteria are also able to break them down and produce these special metabolites. So there's definitely, it's very much a gut-brain food.
It's interestingly, as someone who struggled with mental health, omega-3 is something that really helps to support. And I know there's research around serotonin and also like a faster processing speed and things like that. But I see, and I eat some oily fish, but I also take omega-3 and I see a noticeable difference when I'm taking omega-3.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, there's pretty strong evidence around supplementing with omega-3s as being helping with kind of preventing depression or with supporting people with depression. And then, taking plenty of oily fish has been shown to be one of the strongest dietary factors in helping to prevent kind of cognitive decline in later life as well.
Interesting. Before we close, there is this podcast probably wouldn't be complete without talking about a little bit of biohacking for the biohackers among our listeners and post-biotics. I was reading how you were saying that our gut produces way more. I think it's something like 50,000 I read than anything we could get in a supplement. These supplements are also really quite expensive. Can you explain a little bit more around that?
Yeah, so our gut microbes can have a potential to produce 50,000 metabolites. And that is very much, going back to this piece about diversity of food we eat. For each of our gut bacteria, tend to have different dietary preferences. And then that then helps them to produce these different metabolites. So I think by eating the foods that our gut bacteria love, you're more likely to provide your gut bacteria with what they need to produce this range of metabolites, but also these really important short-chain fatty acids. But I think it's not just about the fibre. We've got to think about the food that the fibre is contained in. You've got lots of different types of fibre. There's not just one type of fibre. You've got all the polyphenols and also there are other kind of phytoactive compounds in there too. And that all those nutrients are going to be absorbed in your small intestine before it even reaches your gut microbiome. And I think we've also got to think about that it's not just that those nutrients and phytoactive chemicals that you're getting. Actually, you're getting some kind of microbes on that food too. So even an apple contains 100 million microbes. That has been shown to still kind of have an effect on your gut microbiome too.
Yeah, really interesting. I remember seeing a post a long time back by Dr. Megan Rossi, who came on the show about that. It's just extraordinary, just the humble apple and what it can do for us. And we forget these things.
Absolutely. Yeah. Arguably much tastier.
Yes, it's true. Than trying to sprinkle in a whole load of exotic powders into your smoothie that may or may not have the same effects. Amazing. I mean, as I say, I had the honor of reading that book and your book in advance and reviewing it. I think it's a fantastic book. So everyone go and check out. When is it out, Emily? It's probably out as we release this. And just tell us more about how listeners can connect with you, with your work, your research, and what's coming up for you. I imagine you're on a bit of a book tour at the moment.
Yeah, so the book is out next week, the 25th of July. So very exciting, very much the build up to that coming out. So that's been phenomenal, and I'm so excited to share this book with the world. It is, I know you've seen it, but it's quite a wedge of a book, but it's very easy. It's very kind of actionable tips, easy breakdown of the science. So I think there'll be lots of juicy, useful bits from it. Otherwise, yeah, please find me on Instagram. I'm Dr. Emily Leeming. And then I'm very keen on Substack. So I write a free weekly newsletter called The Second Brain, on the science of the gut-brain connection. So I enjoy that a lot.
So Substack's the place to go for that if you want to get up to date week by week. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, and good luck with the book tour. I know it's going already. I can see from all your social media just how well it's going, and it's such a needed book. There definitely was a gap in the market for this. So, and thank you for taking the time today to come and talk to us.
No, thank you so much for having me and all the great questions.